She swung the iron ladle like a weapon. Grease flew. Steam hissed. The storage cellar of Thornvale Manor smelled of salt, smoke, and something fiercer, something that had no name but felt very much like survival. The Duchess of Crenwold did not flinch. Around her, barrels of preserved meat stood in tall rows, packed tight with brine and herbs, sealed with wax, labeled in her own careful hand. 50 barrels. 60. More than any house in the county had thought to store since the last hard winter. And the county had laughed. They had laughed all summer long. Lady Prunella Stoke said it at the midsummer gathering, loud enough for 3 tables to hear. The poor widow has lost her mind along with her husband. Salting meat like a butcher's wife. Has she no dignity left? The room had tittered. Fans had fluttered. Even younger maids at Thornvale had whispered behind closed doors. But Duchess Adeline Crenwold had kept working. She had risen before dawn. She had haggled with farmers at the market gate. She had learned from old cook Berthilda how to pack pork fat without spoiling the flesh. She had done all of it quietly, steadily, without a single tear, because tears, she had learned, fed no one. Then the first frost came 3 weeks early. Then the roads iced over. Then the village grain store caught fire. And suddenly, Thornvale was the only house in 4 parishes with enough food to last the winter. Now tell me this, if you were Adeline, and every person who mocked you suddenly came knocking at your gate, would you open it? Drop your answer in the comments. And if this story already has your heart, hit subscribe now, because what the Duke does when he rides and will change everything. The frost came without warning. One morning the fields of Ashwick were green and breathing, and the next they were white and silent, locked under a skin of ice so thick that the farmers who walked out to check their crops came back with nothing but pale faces and shaking hands. 3 weeks before the harvest moon. 3 weeks too soon. The wheat stood frozen in the ground. The root vegetables had barely swelled. The grain store on the edge of Nettleford village had burned to its frame just 4 nights before the frost arrived, and no one had yet figured out whether it was an accident or something worse. The people of Nettleford stood in clusters outside their doors and stared at the white fields and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say, except at Thornvale Manor. At Thornvale, there was noise. There was the heavy thud of barrel lids being checked and sealed. There was the sharp smell of brine drifting out through the stone cellar windows. There was the voice of Duchess Adeline Crenwold calling out counts to her steward, a thin, careful man named Osric Dawn, who followed her through the cellar with a ledger pressed to his chest and ink perpetually on his fingers. 58 barrels of salted pork, Adeline said, moving fast between the rows, pressing her palm to each lid as she passed. 14 of smoked mutton, 9 of dried venison, 6 casks of rendered fat, and the herb-brine fowl. Osric, how many jars? 112, your grace, Osric said, scratching quickly. Good. That will last us. That will last us, and then some. She stopped at the far end of the cellar and put both hands on a barrel the size of a small horse. She had packed this one herself, the first week of June, when the summer heat was at its worst and everyone thought she had cracked under grief. She had been a widow for 7 months at that point. Her husband, the late Duke of Crenwold, had died of a fever in late autumn, quietly, in the room above this very cellar, with only his valet and Adeline beside him. She had cried for 6 days. On the 7th, she had gotten up, gone to the kitchen, and asked old Berthilda, the cook who had served Thornvale for 40 years, to teach her everything she knew about preserving meat. Berthilda had not asked why. She had simply nodded, tied a second apron around the Duchess's waist, and begun. That was how the summer had gone at Thornvale. While the other great houses of the county held garden parties and archery tournaments and long, drowsy lunches on their lawns, Adeline Crenwold had packed meat into barrels. She had salted and smoked and dried and brined. She had haggled at the pre-dawn market gate with farmers who barely hid their smirks. She had ignored the raised eyebrows of every visitor who passed through Thornvale's hall and caught a whiff of the cellar. She had not explained herself to anyone. She had not needed to, but they had talked anyway. The talk had started small, the way talk always does, a remark here, a lifted brow there. Then Lady Prunella Stoke had made her comment at the midsummer gathering, and suddenly it was not a remark anymore. It was a story. The widowed Duchess of Crenwold, salting meat like a common butcher's wife, had lost her mind to grief. She had lost her dignity. She had lost whatever polish 7 years of marriage to a great duke had given her. Adeline had heard every word of it. She had stood 3 feet from Lady Prunella's chair, and she had heard it, and she had set her teacup down very gently, and she had walked away. She had gone home and packed 2 more barrels. Now the frost had come, and Thornvale's cellar was the fullest it had ever been in living memory, and Adeline stood at the end of that row of barrels with something very close to satisfaction sitting quietly in her chest. "Osric," she said, "open the gate." He looked up from his ledger. "Your Grace, open the manor gate, all the way, and send word to Nettleford village. Anyone who needs provisions may come." Osric blinked. He was not a man who blinked often. "Anyone, Your Grace?" "Anyone," she said. He wrote it down without another word, because in 7 months of serving Duchess Adeline Crenwold, he had learned that she said what she meant and meant every syllable. By midday, the lane leading up to Thornvale Manor was full of people. They came quietly at first, in ones and twos, farmers with empty carts and women with covered baskets, children half hidden behind their mothers' skirts. They came with the particular posture of people who were not sure if they deserved what they were coming to ask for. Some of them had laughed at the Duchess themselves, not cruelly, but they had laughed, and now they stood in her lane with their empty hands and the frost visible on their breath. Adeline met them at the cellar door. She did not make speeches. She did not remind anyone of anything. She simply stood beside Berthilda and 2 of the kitchen maids, Gretel and Posy, and she handed out portions of salted pork and smoked mutton and dried venison, measured carefully so that every family in the lane receive enough to last 2 weeks. Her lady's maid, a young woman named Tuttle, kept a separate list of names so that no family was missed. By the time the lane cleared, nearly 3 hours had passed and 41 families had been helped. Adeline sat down on an upturned crate outside the cellar and let herself breathe. Berthilda brought her a cup of hot broth and sat beside her without being asked, which was something only Berthilda ever did. "They'll talk again," the old cook said. "I know," Adeline said. "Different talk this time." "Perhaps." Berthilda looked at her sideways. "You knew the frost was coming early." It was not a question. Adeline wrapped her hands around the cup. "My husband's father wrote in his journals that the summer of 1789 had the same pattern. Hot June, dry July, strange August winds. And that winter came 3 weeks early and took half the livestock in the county." She paused. "I read all of Crenwold's journals after he died. I had nothing else to do. Most widows in your position would have wept and waited," Berthilda said. "I did weep," Adeline said quietly. "I just did not wait." The old cook nodded slowly and said nothing more, and they sat together in the pale afternoon light with the frost creeping steadily across the stone of the courtyard, and it was almost peaceful. It lasted exactly 2 more days. On the 3rd morning, a carriage arrived at the Thornvale gate. Not one of the battered farm carts from Nettleford. A proper carriage, lacquered black, with a coat of arms on the door panel and 2 outriders in livery. Osric saw it from the upper window and came to find Adeline immediately, ledger still in hand. "It is Lady Prunella Stoke," he said, in the careful tone he used when he wanted to say something strongly, but was too professional to say it plainly. Adeline looked up from the household accounts she was reviewing at her writing desk. She considered it for a moment. "Show her to the drawing room," she said, "and bring tea." "Shall I bring the good tea?" Osric asked. "Bring tea, Osric." Lady Prunella Stoke was a woman of 53 who had perfected the art of delivering insults in the exact shape of compliments. She swept into the Thornvale drawing room in a cloud of heavy perfume, kissed the air beside Adeline's cheek, and settled herself into the best chair as though she owned it. "My dear Duchess," she began, "I have come on behalf of several families who find themselves in a rather desperate situation." Adeline poured the tea. "Which families?" "The Stokes, naturally, and the Fenworths. And I believe Lord Galt's housekeeper sent a message to my cook asking whether there was any chance of—" "How much do you need?" Adeline asked. Prunella stopped. She had prepared something longer. "I beg your pardon? How much preserved meat does your household need to last the winter, Lady Prunella? I will have Osric calculate what I can spare, and we will arrange it." The older woman's mouth opened and closed once. Then she said, in a very different voice, smaller and stripped of its performance, 2 weeks' worth. "Perhaps 3. I will send it tomorrow," Adeline said. "Is there anything else?" There was a long silence. Prunella looked at the cup of tea in her hand, then at the woman sitting across from her, this quiet, straight-backed widow who was looking at her without anger or triumph, just steadily, calmly, as though she had already forgiven the thing that had not even been apologized for yet. "I said something unkind," Prunella said at last, very low. "At the midsummer gathering. I said it where you could hear it." "You did," Adeline agreed. "I was wrong." "You were," Adeline said. And then, without hesitation, "The provisions will be at your gate by mid-morning. Good day, Lady Prunella." It was a dismissal delivered so gently that Prunella was halfway down the front steps before she quite realized she had been dismissed. That evening, Osric knocked on the study door. "Your Grace," he said, "there is a letter by private courier. It bears the seal of the Duke of Drevenmore." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Adeline set down her pen very slowly. The Duke of Drevenmore. Cassius Thorne. She had not heard that name spoken in this house for nearly 2 years. He had been her late husband's closest friend, his companion since boyhood, the man who had stood at his right side at their wedding and wept openly, embarrassingly, at the graveside. He had written once after the funeral, a short, formal letter of condolence that had been so carefully worded it felt like it had been written by a barrister and not a man at all. She had not replied. She picked up the letter now. The seal broke cleanly. The handwriting inside was nothing like a barrister's. It was urgent and slightly uneven, the writing of a man who had set pen to paper in a hurry or in strong feeling, possibly both. "Your Grace," it began without preamble, "I write not as ceremony demands, but as need requires. I have received word that the eastern counties are entering a severe winter without adequate stores. I am writing from Drevenmore within the week. I ask only that Thornvale not turn me away at the gate. I am aware of what I am asking. I ask it anyway. Cassius Thorne, Duke of Drevenmore." Adeline read it twice. Then she set it face down on the desk, stood up, and walked to the window. Outside, the frost-covered grounds of Thornvale lay silver and still in the early evening light. The great oak at the far end of the lawn had dropped its leaves all at once, which it only did in a hard year. The fountain in the center of the courtyard had stopped running. The pipes had frozen that morning. Gretel had found a dead starling on the kitchen windowsill, and Berthilda had said quietly that it was a sign of a long, cold season ahead. Adeline pressed one hand flat against the cold glass of the window. Cassius Thorne. She had met him exactly 9 times in her life. She remembered everyone. Not because she had tried to. She simply did. The first time she was 19 and newly engaged to the Duke of Crenwold, and Cassius had arrived at the engagement dinner late, dusty from the road. With a cut above his eyebrow, he refused to explain. He had bowed over her hand with a perfectly straight face and said, very quietly, so only she could hear, "My sincerest congratulations to you both. My friend is a fortunate man. I hope he is aware of it." She had not known what to do with that sentence for approximately 3 years. She still was not entirely sure. "Your Grace." Osric was still at the door. "He comes," she said, without turning from the window. "Prepare the east wing." There was a pause. The East Wing, Your Grace? Not the guest rooms near the East Wing, Osric. The rooms farthest from the main corridor. She paused. And tell Hilda we will need an additional full setting at the table. Not more. One additional. Yes, Your Grace. She heard him leave. She stayed at the window a moment longer, her hands still against the glass, and then she straightened her shoulders, turned back to her desk, and picked up her pen as though the letter had been nothing more than a bill of accounts. She did not sleep well that night. The village of Nettleford, meanwhile, had its own business to attend to. Word had spread, as word always spreads in a village, which is to say faster than fire and twice as hot. The Duchess of Crenwold had opened her stores. The Duchess of Crenwold had fed 41 families. The Duchess of Crenwold, who they had called mad and graceless all summer long, had been the only person in 4 parishes who had thought ahead far enough to save anyone at all. Old Hendrik, who ran the forge and had an opinion on everything, said it loudly at the tavern on the second night. She knew before any of us that the frost was coming. While we were laughing, she was working. The blacksmith's wife, Gruda, said nothing, but she had been one of the families in the lane. She had stood with her basket and her 3 children, and she had received 2 weeks of salted pork and a jar of brine fowl from the Duchess's own hands. And the Duchess had looked at her children and said their names, because she had learned their names, and Gruda had cried all the way home, and she was not a woman who cried easily. The seamstress, a small, fierce woman called Wilda, who had her shop on the main street of Nettleford, and who had an ear for everything and a tongue sharper than her needles, had also been in the lane. She had come alone with a small basket, and she had heard Adeline give careful instructions to young Tuttle about making sure that the elderly widow Cransby at the end of the mill road received a double portion, because she had no family left to bring wood or food. The woman remembered Cransby. Wilda told her apprentices the following morning. She remembered an old woman who couldn't even walk to the lane. She had thought of her before any of us did. By the end of the week, the tone in Nettleford had shifted so completely it was almost strange. Where there had been smirking gossip, there was now something quieter and more durable. Not just gratitude. Something closer to the particular respect people feel when they realize they have badly misjudged someone and the person they misjudged has shown them grace in return. But not everyone felt that. Lord Galt, who held the largest estate in the district after Thornvale, was a man of 60 with a red face and a loud voice who had never much liked the late Duke of Crenwold and liked his widow even less. He had sent his housekeeper to ask for provisions, and the provisions had arrived, promptly and without comment, and this had enraged him in a way he could not quite explain, and so he explained it differently. "She's making a show of it," he told his steward, a nervous man named Brackett who agreed with everything. "Feeding the village like she's some kind of queen, trying to make herself important. Typical widow nonsense, clinging to a position she only has by accident of marriage." Brackett nodded. "And now I hear a duke is riding in. Drevenmore, of all people. What business does Thorn have at Thornvale? The man has his own estates. He doesn't need to come sniffing around a widow's holdings in the middle of a freeze." Brackett nodded again, more carefully this time. "Mark my words," Lord Galt said, stabbing one thick finger at the window in the general direction of Thornvale. "There is something going on there. And when there is something going on, I intend to know about it." He did not know, as he said this, that 3 of his house staff had family in Nettleford who had been fed from Thornvale's stores and were not feeling particularly loyal to Lord Galt at that moment. At Thornvale itself, the days before Cassius Thorn's arrival were busy and strange. Adeline threw herself into the household with twice her usual energy, which was already considerable. She personally checked the East Wing rooms and found dust on the mantel and a cracked window latch, and she stood in the doorway looking at the fireplace for a long moment with an expression that Tuttle, her lady's maid, described later to Gretel as the face she makes when she is feeling something she has decided not to feel. Tuttle was 22 and observant, and had been with Adeline since the year of the marriage. Gretel was 17 and less observant, but very fast, and had already learned that Tuttle's readings of the Duchess were usually accurate. "Who is this Duke?" Gretel asked, wringing out a mop with considerable force. "A very old friend of the late Duke," Tuttle said, smoothing a fresh linen over the bed frame with careful hands. "He was at the wedding. He was at the funeral. Is he old?" "Not very." Gretel considered this. "Is he kind?" Tuttle was quiet for a moment, running her hand along the edge of the windowsill to check for dust. "I think," she said slowly, "that he is the kind of person who is kind in ways that are difficult to see at first." Gretel wrinkled her nose. "What does that mean?" "It means," Tuttle said, folding the corner of the linen with precision, "that when he came to the funeral, he stood at the far end of the churchyard where no one would see him, and he was the last one to leave." Gretel stopped wringing the mop. "And afterward," Tuttle continued in the same even voice, "he stood in the entrance hall for a moment before he left the house, and he looked down the corridor toward the study where her grace was receiving condolences, and he looked for a long time, and then he left without speaking to her." "Why?" Gretel asked. Tuttle smoothed the last corner of the linen and stepped back to look at the bed. "That," she said, "is what I have been wondering for nearly 2 years." The letter that arrived on the 5th morning before Cassius Thorne rode and was not from him. It was from a woman named Countess Brialta Fenworth, a sharp-tongued, fashionable woman of 40 who moved in the highest circles of the county set, and who had a particular habit of arriving in other people's crises the way a crow arrives at a battlefield, not maliciously exactly, but with great attention and a very good eye for what was valuable. She wrote to invite Ottoline to a gathering at Fenworth Hall on the very evening that, by Ottoline's calculation, Cassius Thorne would be arriving at Thornvale. The invitation was gracious, detailed, and almost certainly deliberate. Ottoline read it at breakfast, set it beside her plate, and ate her toast. "Will you go?" Tuttle asked, quietly, from her position near the sideboard where she was pretending to arrange cutlery. "No," Ottoline said. "Shall I send regrets?" "Yes." Ottoline picked up her tea. "Tell her I am occupied with household duties." Tuttle wrote the note. She did not point out that a duchess did not usually decline a countess's invitation on grounds of household duties. She simply wrote the note, sealed it, and handed it to the courier, and if she felt something like relief, she kept it entirely to herself. On the morning of the 6th day, when the frost lay thickest and the sky had the particular white heaviness that comes before snow, Osric appeared at the door of Ottoline's study. "Your Grace," he said, "there is a rider on the North Road." Ottoline did not look up from her work immediately. She finished the line she was writing, set down her pen, blotted the ink, and then she looked up. "One rider?" she asked. "Two." Osric corrected himself. "A lead rider, and then, some distance behind, a larger party. 6 horses at least. Possibly 8. She stood. She walked to the window. Far down the North Road, past the frozen fields and the bare hedgerows, she could see them. Small dark shapes against the white of the frost, moving with steady purpose toward Thornvale's gate. She watched them for a moment. Then she turned from the window and said, to no one in particular, and to herself entirely, "Open the gate." She said it the same way she had said it 5 days ago, when the villagers came with their empty carts. She said it with the same straightness in her spine and the same steadiness in her voice. But her hands, clasped behind her back where no one could see them, were not steady at all. The lead rider came through the gate first. He was not Cassius Thorne. He was a young man, barely 20, with a sharp jaw and military posture, wearing the livery of Drevenmore. He pulled his horse to a stop in the courtyard and swung down with the practiced ease of someone who had ridden hard and long and was used to both. He handed Osric a card without speaking, gave the courtyard a quick, sweeping look that took in the sealed cellar doors, the organized wood piles, the fresh tracks in the frost, and nodded once as though he had confirmed something he already suspected. His name, the card said, was Reeve Dalton, outrider and personal aide to the Duke of Drevenmore. Behind him, the larger party was coming through the gate now. 6 horses, as Osric had counted, plus a supply wagon that had not been visible from the upper window. The wagon was loaded, heavily loaded, covered in oilskin and rope. Adeline stood at the top of the front steps and watched it roll in her courtyard and felt something tighten in her chest that she did not immediately name. And then Cassius Thorne rode in. He came last, which she had not expected. She had expected him to lead. He was a duke. Dukes led, but he came through the gate at the back of his party, on a dark horse that moved quietly despite the frozen ground, and he was looking at the courtyard the way his outrider had looked at it, with that same rapid, assessing attention. Then he looked up and saw her. He stopped his horse. She was too far away to read his expression clearly. She was close enough to see that he had won. He dismounted, gave the reins to a groom without looking away from her, and walked across the courtyard and up the front steps and stopped 2 steps below her so that they were nearly level. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply forgotten. It had been almost 2 years. "Your Grace," he said. "Your Grace," she replied. His eyes moved once, briefly, to the sealed cellar doors across the courtyard, and then back to her. "You prepared," he said. "I did. Good." He said it simply, without flattery or flourish, and it landed differently than a compliment would have. It landed like a statement of fact from someone who understood what the preparation had cost. "The county is in worse shape than the report suggested. I brought what I could from Drevenmoor's stores. If Thornvale will allow it, I would like to combine what I have with what you have and organize a wider distribution." She looked at him for a moment. "You brought supplies," she said. "On the wagon." "Yes." "How much?" "Enough to extend your provisions by 3 weeks. Possibly 4. She turned and looked at the wagon. Then she turned back. "Come inside," she said. "Osric will see to your men and horses. We will discuss the details over supper." She walked back through the front door without waiting to see if he followed, because she already knew he would. Supper at Thornvale that evening was not the quiet, solitary meal it had been for 7 months. Berthilda had risen to the occasion in the particular way she always did, which was silently and with extraordinary results. The table was set with the good linen that had not been used since before the late Duke's illness, and the food was simple but rich, roasted root vegetables from the last of the kitchen garden, thick broth from the bone stock she kept perpetually on the back of the stove, and bread that had come out of the oven an hour before they sat down. Cassius ate with genuine appetite and said so, which made Berthilda, who was listening from the kitchen doorway, make a sound that was not quite a smile and not quite a scoff, but somewhere exactly between them. At the table, it was Adeline and Cassius, and also Osric because she had included him deliberately, and Reeve Dalton because Cassius had asked, and because Adeline believed in useful tables. She had also included Wilda the seamstress, who had arrived at the door that afternoon with a proposal about organizing the distribution of provisions through the village, and had shown Adeline a hand-drawn map of every household in Nettleford with their approximate needs marked in careful ink. Wilda had not sat at a duchess's table before. She sat very straight and spoke very precisely, and within 20 minutes had Cassius Thorne asking her 3 separate questions about the village layout, all of which she answered without hesitation. Adeline watched this and felt something ease slightly in her chest. It was almost working. The evening was almost ordinary. And then Reeve Dalton leaned over and said something quietly to Cassius, and the ease left the room like a candle going out. Cassius set down his spoon. His face did not change dramatically, but his stillness changed, which was different. He looked at Adeline directly. "There is something I should have told you before supper," he said. "I apologize for the timing." The table went quiet. Even Osric stopped writing in his ledger. "I was followed for Drevenmoor," Cassius said. "Not follow the entire way, but for a stretch of the Thornvale Road, approximately 3 miles from this house. My outriders observed a second party, keeping pace with us from the tree line. They turned off before the gate. I did not want to alarm you on arrival, but Reeve confirms they have been seen again since, on the south road. Adeline's hands were still on the table. Do you know who sent them? Not with certainty, Cassius said, but I have a strong suspicion. He said a name then. Lord Galt. The name fell into the room, and no one at the table looked surprised, which itself was a kind of answer. Wilda's jaw tightened. Osric pressed his pen harder against his ledger page. Reeve Dalton looked at the wall. He has been asking questions, Ottoline said, after a moment. About the stores. About who has been receiving provisions. About your visit. Has he approached you directly? No. He sent his steward twice. Both times I was not available. Cassius looked at her steadily. He wants the stores, he said. Not for his household. He has enough for his household. He wants control of the distribution. If he can position himself as the one feeding the county through this winter, it serves his political interests considerably. And he cannot do that, Ottoline said, as long as Thornvale is doing it already. Correct. She picked up her spoon and continued eating. Then we move faster, she said. Wilda, how soon can your map be copied into a working distribution schedule? Wilda blinked once in surprise and then composed herself instantly. 2 days, she said. One if Tuttle helps me. Tuttle will help you, Ottoline said. Osric, write to every household on that map tonight. Tell them provisions will reach them within 4 days. Cassius. She said his name without his title, which she had not done before, and she noticed it a half-second after she said it, and she did not correct it. Can your men ride the outer routes? The farms that are too far for the Nettleford carts? Yes, he said, and his voice had something in it that was not quite controlled, some quality of warmth pressed down beneath professionalism. And he directed his next sentence at a spoon to give them both a moment. Yes, they know the roads. Supper ended. The table cleared, and the work began. Lord Galt made his move on the second morning. He did not come himself. He sent Brackett, his steward, with a letter written in Galt's large, aggressive hand and sealed with his crest. The letter was addressed not to the Duchess of Crenwold, but to the Duke of Drevenmore, which was itself a message, an attempt to step over Ottoline entirely in her own house. Osric brought the letter to Ottoline first. She read it in the study with Cassius, standing by the window. The letter informed the Duke of Drevenmore that Lord Galt, as the senior landowner of the district by tenure, was prepared to assume oversight of all winter provision distribution and requested that both Thornvale's stores and Drevenmore's wagon supplies be transferred to Galt Hall by the end of the week. It also strongly implied, in the careful language of a man who knew how to threaten without technically threatening, that the presence of an unmarried duke at a widowed duchess's home without a chaperone of appropriate standing was attracting comment, and that Galt was simply flagging this as a courtesy. Ottoline set the letter down. She was very quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He is trying to frighten me." "Yes," Cassius said. "He believes that the threat to my reputation will make me step back and allow him to take control." "Yes." She looked at him. He was still by the window, watching the frost outside with the same expression he had used to look at his spoon at supper, which was to say, an expression of controlled attention that was doing significant work. "Does it concern you?" she asked. "The comment about your presence here. It could affect your own standing as well." He turned from the window then and looked at her fully. "I rode 4 days in a freeze to get here," he said. "No letter from Galt concerns me." She held his gaze for a count of 3. Then she looked away first, which she almost never did, and she picked up her pen. "I will write the reply," she said. "In my name, not yours." "Of course," he said. She wrote it in 10 minutes. It was brief and exact. It thanked Lord Galt for his interest in the welfare of the county, noted that the distribution arrangements were already in progress and proceeding effectively, confirmed that the Duke of Drevenmore was a guest of Thornvale in his capacity as an old family friend of the late Duke, and closed by observing that any further correspondence regarding the household's private arrangements should be directed to her steward. It was signed, Ottoline, Duchess of Crenwold. No flittisch, no epaligi, no softening. Cassius read it when she handed it to him for review. He read it twice. Then he set it down and said, "He will not like this." "I know," she said. "He will escalate." "I know that too." He looked at her with something she could not quite categorize, something that sat between admiration and a deeper, older feeling that had no clean name and polite vocabulary. "Then we will be ready when he does," he said. The reply was sent. Brackett received it at Gull Hall at midday, read it, and brought it to his master. And Lord Galt read it standing up and went very red and said several things that Brackett later described to the kitchen staff as not suitable for repetition. By the third morning of Cassius Thorne's stay at Thornvale, the snow had begun. Not the light, decorative snow of early winter that settled briefly and melted by afternoon. This was the real thing, thick and purposeful, piling against the windowsills and swallowing the courtyard stones and turning the North Road into something that was no longer quite a road. Reeve Dalton's outriders came back from the first distribution run covered from boot to shoulder in white, their horses steaming in the cold, their saddlebags empty, which meant the provisions had reached the outer farms. Reeve stood in the kitchen and drank 3 consecutive cups of Berthilda's hot broth without speaking, and Berthilda refilled each one without being asked, which was her highest form of approval. Cassius had ridden with them. Adeline found this out from Gretel, who found it out from the groom who had saddled the horses that morning before dawn. She found out at breakfast, when Cassius's chair was empty and his place had not been touched, and Osric said carefully, "His Grace rode with the outriders this morning, Your Grace." He wished to see the outer road conditions personally. She looked at the empty chair for a moment. Was it his idea or Reeves? "His, Your Grace." She drank her tea and said nothing further. But she stood at the study window at intervals throughout the morning in a way that she would have strongly denied if anyone had pointed it out. He came back in the early afternoon, snow-covered and quieter than usual, and he came directly to the study without changing his coat or removing his riding gloves, which told her the news was not good. "The Harwick farm," he said, without sitting down, 3 miles northeast. "The family has been there 4 days without heat. The father's hands are frostbitten. 2 small children. The mother sent the eldest boy, he's about 12, to Nettleford 3 days ago, but the boy never arrived. We found him sheltering in the old mill barn off the Harwick track. He is unharmed, but half frozen." Adeline was already standing. "Berthilda," she said, loudly enough to carry through to the corridor. Berthilda appeared in the doorway almost immediately. Some part of her had been listening. "We need hot food packed for 5. Enough for 3 days. And the spare blankets from the upper linen press, all of them. And the medicine box. Tuttle knows where it is." 10 minutes, Berthilda said, and was gone. Adeline turned back to Cassius. He was watching her with that quality of focused attention that she had begun to recognize as specifically his, the way he watched things when they mattered to him. "You should stay," she said, because he had already ridden hard that morning. "Tell me the exact road." "I am coming," he said, in a tone that ended the conversation. They went together in the smaller cart, Adeline and Cassius and Reeve Dalton, with Berthilda's pack baskets and the blankets and the medicine box, and they drove through the snow on the Harwick track with the cart wheels crunching and the sky pressing down white and heavy above them. The boy was collected from the mill barn, wrapped in 2 blankets by Adeline's own hands, and held the entire remaining journey by Reeve, who was not a tender man by nature, but held the half-frozen 12-year-old with complete steadiness. The Harwick farm was worse than Cassius had described it. The fireplace had been cold for 2 days. The father, a broad man named Aldworth Harwick, sat in the corner with his hands wrapped in cloth, looking at the floor with the expression of a man who has been too proud and too afraid to ask for help and now cannot decide which of those things he is more ashamed of. His wife, Lena, stood when they came in and said nothing, but her hands shook, not from cold but from relief, and she pressed them together to stop it. The 2 small children were in the bed, both dressed in everything they owned, and they looked at Autoline from over the edge of the blanket with large, careful eyes. Autoline went directly to the fireplace, assessed the wood situation, and said to Reeve, "There is a wood pile outside the east wall. Start it." She turned to Lena. "I'm going to look at your husband's hands. I need you to hold the lamp very steady." Lena held the lamp. Autoline unwrapped Aldworth's hands carefully, working with a gentleness so practiced it looked entirely natural, examined each finger with the quiet concentration of someone who had spent 7 months learning things that duchesses were not expected to learn, cleaned and dressed the frostbitten areas from the medicine box, and rewrapped them in fresh cloth from the basket. Aldworth did not speak through any of this. When she finished, he looked up at her and his throat moved. "You do not need to say anything," she said. "The food will last you 3 days. By then the roads will be passable enough for a cart to bring more." He looked at her for another moment, and then he said, very quietly, "My boy." "Your boy is here," she said. "He is well. He is in the cart outside being force-fed broth by a very determined man." Something shifted in Aldworth's face. His shoulders dropped. He made one sound and covered it with the back of his bandaged hand, and Autoline looked at the fire, which Reeve had now brought to life, to give him the moment. On the drive back, the snow fell harder. Cassius sat across from her in the narrow cart, the Harwick boy asleep between them, tucked against Reeve's side. The cart was slow on the track, and there was nothing to do but sit and wait for the road to pass. He said, eventually and quietly, "You knew to check the outer farms." "Wilda's map," she said. The Harwick name was on it. I noticed it had no mark beside it, which meant they had not come for provisions. Most families with small children and a long road would not be able to come in person. He was quiet for a moment. "You thought of that?" "Someone had to," she said. Another silence. The snow fell. The horse's breath made small clouds in the cold air. "Autoline," he said. It was the first time he had used her name without the title. The first time in all 9 of the times she had known him across all these years. She did not look at him. She looked at the snow-covered track ahead. "Cassius," she said back, just as quietly, just as directly. A door opened and left open by 2 syllables on each side. Neither of them said anything more for the rest of the journey. Lord Galt's next move came that evening, and it was worse than a letter. He came by himself. He arrived at Thornvale's gate at the precise hour when it was too late for a social call and too early for an emergency, which meant it was deliberate. He had 3 men with him, not outriders in livery, but harder-looking men, the kind who were hired for their size and their willingness not to ask questions. Osric met him at the gate and held it. "I wish to speak with the Duke of Drevenmore," Galt said, looking not at Osric but past him at the manor house. "His Grace is not receiving visitors this evening," Osric said. Then the Duchess. "Her Grace is also not receiving." Galt's red face went a shade darker. He was not accustomed to being held at a gate by a steward with ink on his fingers. "I have information," he said, loudly enough that it was clearly intended to be heard beyond the gate, "that this household is withholding provisions that were promised to multiple families in this district. I am prepared to make a formal complaint to the county magistrate." Osric looked at him without expression. "His Grace the Duke of Drevenmore will be happy to meet with the county magistrate at any time of the magistrate's choosing," he said. "The distribution records for all provisions given from this estate are complete and available for inspection." "Is there anything else, Lord Galt?" There was a long pause. Galt looked past Osric at the house again. A light burned in the study window. A single candle. Behind it, a still figure. He did not know if it was the Duchess or the Duke or someone else entirely. He gathered himself, said something under his breath that Osric did not respond to, and turned his horse around. But he said, over his shoulder, "This is not finished." Osric closed the gate, walked back to the house, went to the study, knocked once, and when Autoline said to come in, he opened the door and found her and Cassius at the desk together, bent over Wilda's distribution map. And he said simply, "He has gone, Your Grace." "For now," Cassius said, without looking up. "For now." Osric agreed. He closed the door behind him, went back to his ledger room, sat down, and wrote in the margin of that day's page, in his small, careful hand, "Something is shifting at Thornvale. I cannot yet say whether it is the weather or something else, but I have served this house for 11 years, and I have never felt it like this." He looked at what he had written. Then he closed the ledger very carefully and went to get his own supper. The snow did not stop for 2 days. Thornvale became an island. The North Road disappeared entirely under 3 feet of packed white. The South Road was worse. The Nettleford Lane was passable only on foot, and barely that. The world shrank to the manor's walls, the cellar, the kitchen, the study where the candle burned long into each night, and the courtyard where Reeve Dalton and the Drevenmore men moved in steady rotation, checking horses, res-tacking wood, keeping the pathways between the buildings scraped and safe. Inside, the house had found a rhythm. It was not the rhythm of a household receiving a guest. It was something more functional and more honest than that. Cassius worked. He worked the way he rode, with focus and without performance, sitting across the desk from Autoline each morning with the distribution ledgers between them, tracking what had gone out, calculating what remained, writing letters to the county magistrate that were so precisely worded and so thoroughly documented that Osric read them and said, very quietly to himself, "Galt has no ground left." Wilda came to the manor each morning through the snow on foot, wrapped in everything she owned, and she and Tuttle worked at the long table in the east sitting room with a map and the schedule and a growing pile of notes and receipts, building a record of every provision that had left Thornvale's. Cellars so complete and so organized that it was less a household account and more an argument, a clear, irrefutable argument that could be placed before any magistrate or lord or court in the county and say simply, "This was done, this is who received it, this is how it was measured," and not one barrel was withheld from anyone in need. It was Wilda's idea to make it that organized. "He will say you hid something," she told Autoline on the 4th morning, without preamble or softening. Men like Galt always say that, so we make it impossible to say. Autoline looked at her across the table. "You have dealt with men like Galt before." Wilda's expression did not change, but something behind it did. "My father's shop," she said, 20 years ago. A man of that kind decided the building belonged to him and found 3 different ways to say my father had not paid his dues properly. We lost the shop. She pressed her pen to the paper. "I was 12. I have been waiting to know how to fight that kind of man ever since." Autoline was quiet for a moment. "Then let us fight him properly," she said. The record grew. Every name, every date, every barrel and jar and portion, all of it documented in Wilda's sharp handwriting and cross-referenced in Tuttle's neater one, with Osric's official seal on each page. Meanwhile, the thing between Autoline and Cassius grew too, though less neatly and without any seal at all. It grew in the spaces between work. In a moment each evening when the ledgers were closed and the candle was low, and they sat on opposite sides of the desk in the particular silence of 2 people who have run out of professional reasons to keep talking but are not yet ready to stop. In the way he handed her papers, always angled correctly for her to read without turning them. In the way she poured his tea without asking how he took it, because she had noticed on the first evening and remembered. In the way Berthilda, who noticed everything and said very little, began setting 2 cups instead of 1 on the study tray without being asked. On the 5th evening of the snow, Cassius set down his pen and said, "Tell me about the summer." She looked up. "Which part of it?" "Any part. The part where you decided." She leaned back in her chair and looked at the fire. The room was warm, and the snow was still falling outside the window, and the house was quiet around them with the particular quiet of a place that is full of sleeping people and contained life. "It was not one moment," she said. "It was many small ones. Reading Edmund's journals and finding his grandfather's account of the winter of 1789. Standing in the kitchen and realizing I had no purpose and no direction, and that grief without direction becomes something very dark very quickly. She paused, and Hilda, the cook. She did not pity me, Ottoline said. Everyone else pitied me. She just handed me an apron and said, here's what we do. And something about that, the plainness of it, the practicality, it was exactly what I needed. Something to do with my hands while the rest of me was still trying to find its footing. Cassius was watching her with that quality of attention that she had stopped trying to look away from. Edmund would have been proud, he said. Her chest tightened. Don't, she said gently. I mean it genuinely. I know you do, she said. But when people say that, I always feel as though they are handing Edmund credit for something I did myself. And I did myself. Entirely. A silence. Then he said, You did. I should have said it differently. I am proud of what you did, because I watched it and I know what it cost. She looked at him. You did not watch it. You were at Drevenmore. I had reports, he said, and then more quietly, I asked for them. The fire crackled. The candle shortened. Outside the window, the snow kept falling. Why, she asked. He looked at her steadily. Because after Edmund died, I could not stop thinking about whether you were all right. And I did not know how to ask you directly without it being something other than simply asking. Something other than what? He was quiet for a long moment. Something that might have seemed like I was waiting, he said. Or worse, that I had always been waiting. I did not want you to think that of me. Not then. Not so soon. The room held the sentence. Ottoline looked at the fire for a long time. The flames moved slowly, deep red at the center, gold at the edge. Edmund knew, she said, finally. I think he always knew. He never said so, but he was not a man who missed things. Cassius said nothing. He was a good man, she said. He was a good husband. He was kind and steady, and he cared for this estate and its people genuinely. He did not deserve to die at 44 of a fever that came from nowhere. She stopped. And I did not deserve to spend 7 months being mocked for trying to keep his house and his people alive through a hard winter. No, Cassius said. You did not. She looked at him then, directly, and he looked back, and between them sat everything that had not been said across 9 meetings and 2 years and 4 days of snow, and neither of them reached for it yet because it was not the moment, and they both knew it, and knowing it together was its own kind of closeness. Lord Galt moved on the 6th day. He had spent those 6 days building something, and what he had built was a story. The story was that the Duchess of Crenwold had been selectively distributing provisions, favoring certain families over others for personal and political reasons, and that the Duke of Drevenmore's presence at Thornvale was irregular and improper and cast doubt on the integrity of everything that had happened there since his arrival. He had told this story to 3 county aldermen, 2 local magistrates, and Countess Brialta Finworth, who had received it with great interest and an expression of practiced concern. He sent a formal written complaint to the county magistrate, signed by himself and 2 aldermen whose names appeared on it, because Galt had done favors for both of them years ago, and they had not yet found the courage to stop repaying those favors. The magistrate, a careful man named Aldous Prentice, arrived at Thornvale on the 6th morning with the complaint in hand and the expression of someone who very much did not want to be doing what he was doing. Osric showed him to the drawing room. Ottoline came down alone. She read the complaint standing up, all 3 pages of it, and then she sat on the table and said, Mr. Prentice, how long have you served as county magistrate? 14 years, your grace. And in 14 years, has Lord Galt filed a complaint against any household that was not in some way inconvenient to his own interests? Prentice was quiet for a moment. I am not at liberty to— You do not need to answer, she said. Come with me. She took him to the east sitting room, where Wilda and Tuttle's records were laid out on the long table. Every page, every name, every date. Prentice looked at it. He was a careful man. He read carefully. He turned pages slowly and read the columns of names and quantities and dates, and he was quiet for a very long time. Then Cassius came in. He had clearly been told Prentice was there, because he came in with his own documents, the Drevenmore supply records, matching Thornvale's in detail and precision, showing exactly what had arrived on the wagon, how it had been divided, and which routes his men had ridden to deliver it. He set them on the table beside Wilda's records without saying anything. Prentice looked at the combined documentation. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked up at Autoline and said, in a very different voice than the one he had arrived with, "This is the most complete provision record I have seen produced by any private estate in 30 years of county administration." "Yes," Autoline said. "I imagine it is." Prentice gathered the complaint from the table where she had left it. He folded it once. He put it in his coat pocket. "I will be writing to the alderman who signed this," he said carefully, "to inform them that a full review of the complaint has found no basis for any of its claims." He paused. "And I will be writing to Lord Galt." "Thank you, Mr. Prentice," Autoline said. "Berthilda will have something warm for you in your horse before you go." After he left, the drawing room was very quiet. Wilda, who had stood in the corner of the east sitting room the entire time without being introduced or asked to leave, came to the doorway. "Is it done?" she asked. "The complaint is done," Cassius said. "Galt is not." "No," Autoline agreed. "But he is smaller than he was this morning." Wilda looked at the table of records she and Tuttle had built over 6 days of careful work. Then she picked up her coat, folded it over her arm, and said, with the particular dignity of a woman who has waited 20 years for one moment, "Good." Part 6. On the 7th morning, the snow stopped. It stopped the way hard things sometimes stop, all at once between one breath and the next, leaving behind a silence so complete it had texture. The sky came out pale and bright. The courtyard filled with hard, clean light that made every frozen surface glitter. The north road was still buried, but the south road was clearing, and by midday the Nettleford Lane had been opened by 4 farmers from the village who arrived with shovels before anyone had asked them. Old Hendrick from the forge was one of them. He worked without speaking for 2 hours straight, and when the lane was clear he stood at Thornvale's gate with his hat in his hands and asked if he could speak with the Duchess. Osric brought him to the kitchen, because Autoline was there with Berthilda reviewing what remained in the cellar, and Hendrick stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat held in both hands and said, "I spoke up for you, Your Grace. At the tavern. I told them you knew. I wanted you to hear it from me." Autoline looked at him for a moment. "I heard," she said. "Thank you, Hendrick." He nodded once and left, and that was that. By afternoon, the road was passable enough for careful riding, and 2 more families arrived at the gate, not for provisions this time, but simply to see the manor, to see the Duchess, to stand in the lane and be reassured that Thornvale was still standing and the stores were still there, and the woman who had fed them through the worst of the freeze was still at the door. Autoline stood at the door and spoke to each of them. Cassius watched from the upper window of the east wing. He watched her speak to an old man who had lost 2 sheep to the freeze and needed help knowing who to speak to about replacing his stock. He watched her direct the man to Osric with a specificity that meant she had already thought about this problem and had a partial answer ready. He watched her crouch down to speak to a child who had come with her grandmother, placing herself level with the child so she was not towering, not performing kindness, but simply being level with it. He had been at Thornvale for 7 days. He had ridden from Drevenmore through 4 days of worsening freeze because the reports had told him the eastern counties were in trouble, and because, underneath that, a reason he had spent 2 years pressing carefully down, he needed to see for himself that she was all right. She was not all right in the way people meant when they said it about widows. She was not recovered and restored and moving on. She was something more complicated and more real than that. She was a woman who had taken the worst thing that had happened to her and built something durable out of it, who had been mocked and dismissed and threatened and had met every single one of those things with a steadiness that came not from hardness, but from a deep, practiced, determined commitment to keeping going. Edmund had loved her well. He knew that. He had watched his friend love her well across 7 years of marriage, and he had been glad of it, genuinely glad. and he had also carried, quietly and without ever acting on it, the knowledge that he had felt something the moment he met her at that engagement dinner that had not gone away. He had never acted on it. He would not have. But Edmund was gone, and the world had changed, and Cassius had ridden 4 days in a freeze, and there was a name between them now. Just 2 syllables on each side, left open like a door, and he could not leave Thornvale without walking through it or at least standing honestly in the frame. He came downstairs when the last visitor had left the lane. She was in the study, standing at the window again, looking out at the brightening courtyard. She heard him come in, and she said, without turning, "The road will be clear by tomorrow." "Yes," he said, "your men will want to start back." "They will." She turned then. She looked at him with the direct, clear gaze she had used from the first moment on the front steps. The gaze that did not soften things unnecessarily or pretend to misunderstand what was in the room. "How long have you been planning to say something?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. 2 years, he said honestly. She nodded slowly. "I thought it might be something like that. Does it trouble you?" She considered the question with the same seriousness she considered the distribution ledgers. "No," she said. "It clarifies things." He took 2 steps into the room. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said. "I want to be plain about that. I did not come here with an intention. I came because the county was in trouble and because I could not stay at Drevenmore knowing you were managing this alone and not at least offering what I had." "I know," she said. "But I also," he continued steadily, "cannot ride back to Drevenmore without telling you that the 2 years of silence was not distance. It was restraint. And I would like you to know the difference." The study held the words. The fire burned low. The courtyard outside was bright with the aftermath of snow, and the light came in slanted and clean across the desk with its closed ledgers and its 2 cups and its months of careful work. Adeline looked at him for a long time. "Edmund trusted you more than any person alive," she said. "He told me once that Cassius Thorne was the finest man he had ever known, and Edmund was not a man who said that lightly or often." She paused. "I trust his judgment." Cassius was very still. "I am not ready," she said. "To be clear, I am not ready for whatever this is. I am 7 months a widow, and I have spent those 7 months learning how to be a person on my own terms, and I am not finished with that yet." "I know," he said, "but I'm also not asking you to leave," she said. "And I'm not pretending that the last 7 days have been nothing, because they have been a great deal." He breathed out slowly. "Then what are you asking?" She tilted her head slightly. "I'm asking you to come back in the spring," she said. "When the roads are good and the county is no longer in crisis and there is no practical reason for you to be here. Come back then, and we will see what this is when it has no emergency to stand inside." He looked at her. The light moved across the room. Somewhere in the house, Berthilda dropped something metal and said something sharp in the kitchen, and then there was the sound of Gretel laughing, and the house breathed around them. "Spring," he said. "Spring," she confirmed. He nodded once. It was the nod of a man who has been given something careful and real and knows better than to grab at it. Lord Galt's final move came the following morning, and it was the move of a man who had run out of legitimate options. He appeared on the Thornvale lane at 8 in the morning himself, without his hard-looking men this time, just Brackett behind him and a face that had moved past red into something paler and tighter. He had received Prentice's letter the previous afternoon. He had also received, overnight, a notice from 2 of the 3 aldermen who had signed his complaint, withdrawing their names from it. One had written only a single sentence. He could not in good conscience maintain a claim he now knew to be false. Galt knew who had spoken to those aldermen. He knew because Cassius Thorne had ridden to both their houses the previous day in the clearing weather and had sat with each of them and shown them the same documents Prentice had seen and said, very quietly, the things that needed to be said. Galt stood at the Thornvale gate, and Osric came to meet him. "I will speak with her," Galt said. One moment, Osric said. He went inside. He came back 2 minutes later. He opened the gate fully and stood aside. "Her Grace will receive you in the drawing room," he said. "Alone." Galt went in. He walked through the hall. He had not been inside Thornvale for 3 years, not since before the late Duke's illness, and the house was different to how he remembered it. Quieter, more purposeful. The hall did not have the slightly neglected feeling that large houses get when their owners are in decline. It had the feeling of a place that was actively cared for, that had been thought about and worked on and tended. He went into the drawing room. Adeline was already there, standing. She did not sit, and she did not invite him to sit, which meant the meeting would be as long as she decided and no longer. He recognized a maneuver because he had used it himself. He looked at her across the drawing room, and something in his chest shifted. Not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to honesty that he was not accustomed to feeling and did not much enjoy. "I misjudged the situation," he said. "You did," she said. "The complaint was filed in error." "It was filed in malice," she said. "But I accept that you know that." He was silent for a moment. He had prepared something longer, something with more architecture to it, more exits and qualifications. Standing in front of her now, all seemed useless. "What do you want?" he asked. "Nothing from you," she said, "except that you leave this household and the people it has helped entirely alone from this point forward. No more complaints. No more letters to my steward. No more men on the South Road. And when the spring provisioning begins for the county, you will direct any family on your land who needs help to Wilda Marsh in Nettleford, who is organizing the distribution. You will direct them there, and you will not interfere." Galt looked at her. "And if I agree to that, then I will not take the matter further," she said. "The records stay on file. Mr. Prentice keeps his letter. But nothing moves forward." Another silence. The drawing room clock ticked. "Agreed," he said. She nodded once. "Good day, Lord Galt." He left. Brackett followed him. The gate closed behind them, and they drove away down the freshly cleared lane without looking back, and Osric watched them go from the upper window with his pen in his hand and wrote one word in the margin of his ledger. Done. Cassius and his party rode out the following morning. The courtyard was full of cold, bright air and the sound of horses and the efficient noise of departure, saddlebags being fixed and oilskins checked, and Reeve Dalton issuing quiet instructions to the outriders with his usual crisp economy. Berthilda gave Reeve a wrapped parcel for the road without explanation, and he accepted it with the closest thing to surprise his face was capable of producing. Gretel and Posey stood by the kitchen door and watched with the particular intensity of young women watching something they will describe to each other later in great detail. Tuttle stood at the upper window, where Cassius had stood 2 days before, and said nothing. Osric stood at the foot of the front steps with his ledger and pretended to read it. Adeline stood at the top of the front steps. Cassius came to the bottom of the steps and looked up at her. He had his riding coat on and his gloves, and he was fully equipped for the road, present and contained and ready to go, except for the way he looked at her, which was not ready at all. "Spring," he said. "Spring," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Not the moment of a man who is simply saying goodbye. The moment of a man who is memorizing something he fully intends to come back to. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode through the gate. She watched him go. She watched until the horses were small dark shapes on the white road, moving steadily away through the bright cold morning, getting smaller and smaller until the road curved behind the bare hedgerows and took them out of sight. Then she stood a moment longer, just standing, her hands at her sides, looking at the empty road. Berthilda appeared at the door behind her. "Tea," she said, which was not a question. "Yes," Ottoline said. She turned and went back inside, and the gate swung gently in the cold air behind her, and Thornvale Manor stood in the winter light exactly as it had always stood, solid and stone and enduring, full of preserved meat and careful records and the quiet, durable lives of the people who kept it going. But something in it had shifted, something small and certain, the kind of shift that does not announce itself loudly, that you only notice in the weeks afterward, in the way the mornings feel different, in the way a name sits differently in your chest than it did before, in the way spring seemed suddenly like a season worth counting toward. Adeline sat at her desk, opened the ledger to a fresh page, picked up her pen, and began to write. In Nettleford, Wilda Marsh pinned a fresh copy of the distribution map to the wall of her shop, smoothed it with both palms, and looked at the name Thornvale written at the center of it where all the lines met, and she felt something she had not felt since she was 12 years old, standing in her father's empty shop. She felt that things could be made right. Old Hendrik would say later, at the tavern, when people asked him how it had all come about, how one widow woman with a cellar full of salted meat had held an entire county together through the worst freeze in 30 years and faced down a powerful man and come out standing. He would say it's simply the way forge men say things. She knew what was coming, he said, and she got ready. That is the whole of it. But Gruda, his wife, who was sitting beside him and who had stood in the lane with her 3 children and her empty basket and received 2 weeks of food from a duchess's own hands, said something different. It is not the whole of it, Gruda said. She did not just get ready. She got ready and then she opened the gate. That is the part that matters. Anyone can prepare. Not everyone opens the gate. The tavern was quiet for a moment. Then old Hendrik raised his cup, and no one in Nettleford disagreed. If Adeline had turned you away at that gate after everything they said about her, would you have blamed her? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if this story moved something in you, if you felt every bit of her strength and her silence and her waiting, please hit the subscribe button right now.